Good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. Our first item on our agenda today is to get evidence on the cost effectiveness of Scottish public inquiries. And therefore welcome to the meeting John Sturrock KC and John Campbell KC. And I would say we've also had apologies this morning from Craig Hoy, who will be a few minutes late due to traffic. I'd like to thank you both for your very short, sharp and helpful submissions to the committee's call for views. And we'll move straight to questions. So let's see, where do we kick off? Mr. Sturrock, methinks. You've said in answer to the question 2 that we have set out in relation to transparency, that you've said there's insufficient transparency and scrutiny, in particular around control over timescales and costs in reference to public inquiries. So I'm just wondering how that can be improved.
By the provision of more information, one would have thought.
Okay.
From the start.
Anything specific?
Well, from the start of the process, in terms of the framing, if you like, of the scope, the budget, and understanding of potential timescales, through the currency of the process with regular reporting and updates, which I understand some inquiries do on timing, costing, and so forth. And one would certainly expect at the end of the process there to be a proper analysis of all that has taken place in terms of cost and time. I'm not experienced, I don't come with a particular background in public inquiries, but I certainly find the whole thing opaque, and I'm concerned about the large sums of public money which are spent and about which there seems to be relatively little discourse, accountability or transparency. So the provision of more, greater, regular information would be the short answer to the question.
I mean, you've really hit the nail on the head to a large extent on why we're actually having this investigation, if you want to call it that. And I think opaque is a pretty good word to describe it, certainly in terms of a lot of the evidence that we've been receiving so far. Now, Mr. Campbell, you've taken a kind of different tack in terms of the same question. You've said, you see, I see no merit in publishing individual remunerations. Publication of overall accounts after the event would appear to be a necessary part of the process. But Professor Sandy Cameron, who was the first to give evidence to our committee, talked about the view that because there appears to be no motivation to keep, let's just say, the inquiry to time and to budget, then there's no real there's no incentive to do that. And would it not be that if, for example, remunerations were published, that would help to focus minds a wee bit more?
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to appear. With respect to Professor Cameron, I don't agree with him. One can only speak from experience. When we set out 20 years ago now to do the Parliament inquiry, we had no idea what it would cost, because the cost depended on the level of cooperation from 3 parties: the contractors, the professional teams, and the civil service, all of whom were asked in a non-statutory inquiry to provide information. And not all of those were as cooperative as one would have liked. So what we decided to do was to keep I should have said, the lawyers involved, of whom there were only 2, were offered rates to begin with and accepted those rates. And they were not initially published, but they were accepted by the Scottish Executive, as it then was, the Scottish Office, as it then was, I beg its pardon. And we worked to those rates. What we did was, what the Inquiry Secretary did was, he kept a running total, obviously, of what the inquiry was costing. And he told us monthly what the whole process was costing. Now, for example, I had to send my solicitor to Barcelona to take some statements from the architects team. And there's an added cost which we didn't anticipate in the beginning. So we knew a month later what all that had cost. The chairman and the secretary knew the overall cost month to month. And when we looked as if we were running into, because remember the Parliament inquiry was about cost overruns, so this was quite quite close to home. We knew month to month what everything was costing when it was close to target, or looking as if it was coming close to target. We went back to the Scottish Executive and said, we're not there yet because we've got these things to do, but the cost so far is X, and we'd like you to sanction X plus 10 or X plus whatever. In the result, that worked well. We'd guessed £1 million, and we came in at 900 and something, and on time, despite having to go to Barcelona. Now, that wasn't a perfect method, and it certainly wasn't public. The report, I brought you a copy, just so you can see what a nice short report looks like.
Yeah, you don't get many reports in the public inquiries as short as that, basically, to that.
We had a sort of notional in-house target of 250 pages, and we're
Yeah.
a million miles off that. The team knew what the cost was month to month, and we decided we would not publish it because there were probably no questions about it in those days. That's 20 years ago. But the figures were published after the inquiry was over, and subject, of course, to running scrutiny from the Auditor General, who was a friend of the inquiry and very helpful to us in organising our cost records so that we could see what we were doing. So I think that was transparent inwardly, not publicly transparent.
Right, okay, but I mean, I suppose the Scottish Government could say that they practice inward transparency. If they said that in the Chamber, I think there'd be a howl from opposition parties, to be perfectly honest with you, and probably from members of the Government Party.
I'm talking about the inquiry team.
Myself.
I'm talking about the inquiry team. I'm not talking about the Scottish Government. We kept quite a lot of things from the Scottish Government until we were ready to tell them about it.
Right. I think, I mean, in this age, there's certainly a kind of clamouring for transparency, because it is public money. Because one of the issues, I think, about this whole inquiry that we uncovered in last week was very stark. If you've seen the official report of what happened, or indeed watched the session itself, was that it's the opportunity costs that I think are causing the greatest concern, not just the overall sum of money. So the police, for example, have talked about the huge impact in terms of financial and staff resources. You can look at also the stress and all sorts of other issues if you so wish, but these are two main issues that they've actually faced. And okay, we can look at that and say there should be perhaps a separate fund for public inquiries rather than being taken out of the specific service that it relates to. But even so, when inquiries are ongoing now under the current system progress, if it's seen that an inquiry that maybe was expected to take 1 or 2 years, or is taking 5 or 10 years or even longer, then surely the need for transparency is high, given that there seems to be an open-ended budget. And as has been pointed out by a number of individuals, we're struggling to think of another area of public life where there are no budgetary or timescale parameters. I mean, you know, every area of life, including life or death areas such as the health service.
Well, I agree with that, and I think in a long inquiry, or an inquiry which stretches, unwittingly stretches out, then there is a case for transparency. The trouble is, if you have a King's Counsel on £1,000 a day, then after 6 months, some newspaper will publish a figure which is just the number of days times £1,000, and that's meant to look bad because everybody hates lawyers. Actually, the rates are not nearly commercial rates. I'm just using £1,000 as an example, but the rates offered for public inquiries are not commercial rates. They're quite well below commercial rates. And I don't know that there's really a solution to this. People have a right to know, and if that's your proposition, then I respectfully agree with it. People are interested, and that's right, and the press should get that information. But how it's treated by the inquiry management, I think, needs to be looked at.
Okay, I mean, in terms of the process for setting and monitoring costs for public inquiries and whether they're adequate or not, Mr. Campbell, you've said the process is adequate in the correct hands. So, given the huge overruns that we've seen in many inquiries in terms of time and in terms of budget, does this mean that perhaps you know, they've not been in the correct hands? I mean, what does
Well, if a minister commissions, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, but
I'm asking
if
a
a
question
minister,
and your answer, that's
if
absolutely
a
fine.
minister commissions a public inquiry, then he or she would do well to sit down with the chairman who is appointed and responsible officials and try and do a bit of cost planning, just as you would if you were building a public building or undertaking some other public endeavour. And the minister should then expect that figure to go up. Look where we're sitting. I mean, that's what happened in this building. The minister has to take responsibility for that because he or she commissioned the inquiry. And I think a chairman can rightly expect a minister to speak up on his or her behalf if cost overruns do turn out to happen. If we look at the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, that has stretched for many, many years well beyond what was initially anticipated, and the decision's been taken to see it through to the end. The same is true of the Tram Inquiry. I think the Tram Inquiry grew arms and legs. The decision was taken to see it through to the end. Now, that's a responsibility of ministers.
Indeed, but I mean, but where is the justice in that? If you think about the Child Abuse Inquiry, even £96 million so far, but 11 years, some of the people to whom this inquiry would have been directed, you know, to deliver justice for, will be long dead by the time this report's out. You know, it just seems to me to, like, it may grow arms and legs and go on and on and on, but how does that deliver for the people it's meant to?
Well, the Child Abuse Inquiry has dealt with that question by issuing interim reports. In a small inquiry like the Scottish Parliament inquiry, there was no need to do that. And we did consider it. We thought it would be a waste of time to pause. Now, you're asking me two questions. You're asking about cost, and you're also asking about justice for victims.
Yeah, but the point is that if there's no time limit and that implies a cost limit, then how can justice really be delivered for people if it goes on and on and on and on? You know, the two are pretty directly related, I would have thought. You know, it's like, you know, having an operation, if it's postponed for 5 years, you know, I mean, you know, how is that helpful, you know, to an individual?
Well, rigorous programme setting and rigorous questioning, which is disciplined, is one solution. You shouldn't allow yourself to go down rabbit holes unless the rabbit hole is worth... Sorry, that's a terrible metaphor, but...
Sorry, you know the first to use it.
You shouldn't allow yourself to be dragged away from the core purpose of the remit. You know, all these things are linked. It's a bit like a chain and a necklace. Every link has to close, and you start with your remit. Now, I seem to remember we started, in this case, with a sentence which had 170 words in it, and that came from the Minister's office. We thought that wasn't probably the best approach, so we spoke to them and got it made more concise and more focused.
Okay. I mean, Mr Sturrock, I mean, you've said that there should in fact be a clear business plan, a budget to cover planned activities, project scoping carried out at the outset. Now, given the number of inquiries around Scotland and the UK, one would have thought that would happen. And yet it doesn't seem to have had any impact in terms of the duration of inquiries to date. How do you think that can perhaps be tightened up somewhat, providing clarity for all concerned?
Listening to the conversation so far, there are two different issues at play here. One is the information provision about cost and whether that cost is justified. The second issue is the very nature of the process which is being undertaken, and that perhaps takes us to the design of the public inquiry process. So if one takes even the way in which things are done at the present time, it seems that there's huge scope for there to be more work to be done at the beginning of a process, and John's alluded to this to some extent, in terms of the design of the process, the issues which are to be addressed, the overall purpose of the process, and within that, the timescale within which the inquiry might take place. Now, of course, as John has said, these are always going to be subject to change as more information becomes available. But that's looking at things in the present context. I think my presence here probably is because I have a different perspective to offer. So just by way of background, I left the practice of law 23 years ago because I wanted to pursue a different way of finding solutions to things, and I pursued mediation as my professional career. And in a way, the experience I have in that regard is mirrored in the macro experience is mirrored in the micro experience, if you like, of public inquiries, because I left behind the process of litigation with all its adversarialism and forensic approach to detail and its cost and time consumption. And my experience over these years is that there are different ways, sometimes more effective ways, of arriving at outcomes more quickly and more cost effectively. So I translate that into the world then of public inquiries, and I ask myself and I ask you whether it's possible that some at least of these issues which are dealt with in the conventional way in public inquiries might be addressed in a different way, which would be more cost-effective, more time-effective, and might actually produce, to use your words, Convener, more just outcomes, although I think one has to be clear about what the purpose of the inquiry is and whether justice is in fact one of the potential outcomes. And if I may, then I draw on my own experience, which dates back actually to 2018 and 2019, not 2019 and 2020, as I said in my submission, when I was asked by the Cabinet Secretary for Health to carry out a review into allegations of bullying and harassment in NHS Highland. Now, these were serious issues involving hundreds of people, involving a management culture, the board governance issues, issues which the subsequent report revealed were perhaps applicable to many other public sector organisations in Scotland also. That review was carried out in 18 weeks. The report was submitted in 3 months. Now, it's not perfect. There are trade-offs, of course, in a situation like that. But to take Professor Ayrton's criteria of timely, credible and impactful, that report was produced and was available in a time frame which was relevant to the issues and enabled the organisation and individual to deal with the issues which arose in the time frame in which the concerns had arisen. So I don't say that in any way to promote myself or to promote that particular approach for all situations, of course, but it does suggest to me that there are different ways by which public inquiry can be conducted.
Yes, I mean, I was very impressed by the fact that that report that you did in the NHS Highlands came in for, I think, less than £150,000. It seems to have been successful. I think one of the issues, of course, as you've talked about, and you've given quite a substantive response to the specific area, is with regard to culture. And you've talked about, you know, a likely consequence of a culture in which, you know, you seek to look, inquiry seeks to, or the people who want the inquiry want to look back and find fault or allocate blame rather than look forward and less lessons with about what worked and how things could be done differently or better in the future. Now, obviously, the last 24 hours we've already seen kind of an issue with regard south of the border with regard to grooming about a very specific inquiry which is in the news today. And also in Scotland, we've got a clamour for another public inquiry to be held into RAC, and they made clear they wanted a statutory, i.e. judge-led inquiry. Now, I imagine that would take a considerable period of time. So how do we actually change? Is there any way in which we can turn the Titanic away from the iceberg in this and say that, well, while there is always going to be a role for public inquiries, how do we persuade the public, for example, or indeed ministers who instruct these, that there is a better way forward or a different way forward?
Well, it's an education process, I suspect, isn't it? When you use the expression Titanic and iceberg,
people want a Ferrari rather than a Ford, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I was thinking of tankers and tugs. In a sense, you've got tankers here which are so difficult once they've started to move to pilot, to navigate with. Whereas, again, to use Professor Ayrton's words, or Dr. Ayrton's words, flexibility, nimbleness, tailored approaches, you know, what a tug, if you like, to use that metaphor, can do. I think it's hugely to do with education about what public inquiries are actually intended to do and to be. My understanding is that public inquiries are not primarily designed to find fault. They're designed to find out what happened, why it happened, what could have been done differently, and how, very importantly, and this is a very different skill set, very importantly, what can be done differently in the future. And actually, there's a very good paper which I'll send to the clerk by the Centre for Effective Dispute Resolution, my colleagues in London, which I just came across last night, all about a new approach to public inquiries. And they make the very clear point that there's a distinction between fact-finding, evidence-gathering, and looking to the past, which may be well within the province of a judicial process, although even that might be forensic, overly detailed and lengthy, and the curation, if you like, of solutions for the future, based perhaps on the evidence of what's happened in the past, but looking creatively. And they suggest that that might be a quite different approach and might need quite different facilitation. So I think, Chair, just convenient in response to your question, it's about education, it's about an understanding of what the purpose of these inquiries are, clarity about that, and ministers perhaps be a bit more focused, a bit more clear about what it is that they hope to achieve with these and what the public is entitled to expect from them.
I wonder, Convener, if I could offer you...
Of course, yeah.
If I could offer you two slightly different perspectives. 20 years ago, we didn't understand mediation as John has propounded it, as well as we do now. But 20 years ago, you'll remember the death of Dr. David Kelly and the subsequent public inquiry chaired by Lord Hutton.
Chilcot, yeah.
No,
Not
Lord
Chilcot.
Hutton. Lord Hutton was a Northern Ireland judge.
Oh, yeah.
And that just happened at about the same time as the Holyrood issue was brewing up. And I was sent to London to watch Lord Hutton in action for a couple of days. And he had decided that his counsel should be the only person asking questions. Anybody could attend, and they could attend by counsel or solicitors, but they weren't going to be allowed to ask questions unless counsel to the inquiry said they could. So that puts counsel to the inquiry in a pretty strong position. And it just so happens that I know him, and now he sits on the English bench. And what he did to counsel for the BBC, for example, was say, no, we don't want to hear about that. No, we don't want to hear about that. Oh, look, yes, we do want to hear about that. You've got half an hour. And Lord Hutton, who was pretty steely, ruled that with a rod, and that's how they got through it so quickly. So that's one perspective. When Fraser appointed me, we sat down and discussed whether we would adopt that method, that style. And I said to him, well, you're bound to be judicially reviewed if you adopt that style because you're keeping lawyers out. So he said, well, that's fine. If that's what the court says we have to do, we'll do it. But nevertheless, I want you to write a short speech, this is talking to me, explaining why you're going to be the only one asking questions, and let's see if there's a judicial review. Well, it wasn't even threatened. Everybody meekly said, oh, yeah, all right, fine, okay, we'll do that. And so for 9 months, I got very tired of the sound of my own voice because I was the only one speaking. But so that's one perspective, and it certainly speeded things up because I could decide what I wanted to talk about on a particular day with a particular witness.
I mean, I have to say other witnesses have suggested something like that, very similar. So I think probably there's a strong view that is a fairly sensible approach rather than.
I said two perspectives, Convener. The second perspective takes us away from the notorious public inquiry to another form of public inquiry, which involves planning. And since Holyrood, I've done probably 100 planning inquiries at least, and they adopt. When I started doing them, it was all cross-examination. It was all lawyers showing off, and we spent days and days cross-examining witnesses on the minutiae of planning decisions. I don't think necessarily to the greater benefit of the public, because everything costs money. But as time has gone on, the rules have evolved, and the planning industry now has things called hearings, rather like this meeting, where the tables are arranged in a circle or a square, and the reporter in charge is the person who sets the agenda. And what a good reporter will do is he will circulate the points he wants to discuss in advance, a week or two, not very long in advance, to allow parties to prepare to answer his questions or her questions. And in that way, evidence is gathered, but much more quickly than can be done with cross-examination. There are, however, topics which merit cross-examination, either because they're technically difficult or because they're notorious. And I can see, reading Hardy's report, that there were occasions when the witnesses were sitting in a very hot seat and cross-examination was entirely appropriate because they were being asked to answer difficult questions. But there are many occasions in planning inquiries where the evidence is an issue, but where it isn't hot, it doesn't require cross-examination. So a reporter can ask a question about, I don't know, a national scenic area, say, something of that sort, a relatively benign topic, and then the parties around the room are asked one at a time to say what they think about the particular issue. And they will then, the reporter will then take a note and move on to the next topic. And that gets through evidence very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you've said actually that cross-examination can take time, but almost always yields results. But it doesn't have to be used in every circumstance, is what you're basically saying. And perhaps it's a kind of sledgehammer to wield a nut on occasion.
Yeah. And not everybody's good at it. Which is, some take longer than others, and that's just the way of the world, I'm afraid. But if time, cost, and quality are the triumvirate that we're looking at here, you get more time, or you take more time with cross-examination. You probably cost more money because it takes longer, and arguably on a controversial topic you get better quality, but not necessarily. It's a judgment call.
I mean, just lastly for me, I'm just going to touch on the kind of the outcome of inquiries in terms of recommendations. A government, might feel political heat, as we've seen in the UK Parliament in the last 40 hours, I suppose, to take forward inquiries. But they drag on for years. It may be a different government, maybe a different political party that's in office that ends up with the report from the inquiry, and the government of the day may or may not agree to recommendations, but often they say yes, we'll implement those recommendations, but there doesn't seem then to be any timescale or incentive to deliver those, such that the people who perhaps thought, we'll have a public inquiry, what we are saying will be justified and will be compensated, or others will be blamed, or there will be improvements made, whatever the aim of the inquiry is. Now, you've said, Mr Campbell, that, for example, it's not really for an inquiry to follow up in terms of recommendations, but one of the things that Professor Cameron said when he was giving evidence in terms of the Jersey abuse inquiry was a couple of things. First of all, he said the recommendations that were made in the first public inquiry in Scotland in 1945 are more or less the same recommendations being made 80 years later, because nobody's really done much about them, as they should, which I found quite shocking. But when he was in Jersey, he said that they went back 2 years later to check and to ensure that the recommendations were being implemented. So, while it may not be the role of an inquiry specifically, should the inquiry team or not look at that perhaps after a certain time period, a year, 2 years, whatever is appropriate in that case, to try and ensure that recommendations they have made are indeed implemented? Again, we've seen some of that in the media in the last 24, 40 hours about the previous inquiry in grooming. There's been so I'm just wondering what your view is, if that would be a way forward rather than inquiry saying, right, that's us, we'll produce the report, we're off. Well, Mr Sturrock first. Sorry, Mr Campbell first, then you, Mr Sturrock.
Sorry.
I'm going to ask you something slightly different.
I think your question begs a political question. If a minister appoints a chairman, he's got to be sure that that chairman is going to be willing to follow through after the inquiry is over to see that his recommendations are fulfilled. Now,
but you've said implementation is not for the inquiry.
Well, I don't believe it is. The clue's in the name. It's an inquiry into what happened and the yielding of results as to what happened, or the discovery of results as to what happened, and with recommendations. Now, what happened at Holyrood was that recommendations are published, not many, a dozen, And the result of that was that the procurement of public buildings in Scotland was radically modified by the promulgation of new rules, which obtained today. Neither Peter Fraser or the late Peter Fraser nor I nor any of the inquiry team were involved in the promulgation of those new rules. I'm not sure whether Lord Hardy would have welcomed a commission to see how well the trams were working once he'd finished. On the other hand, one can see a situation like the social work type of cases that Professor Cameron was talking about, where they have acquired all that expertise in the course of the inquiry, all that knowledge, and there would be value. It's a separate commission, but there would be value in sending them back in to see what's happening a couple of years later. But it's a political, with respect, I think it's a political decision to do that.
No, I appreciate that it is, but I think there's an issue about, I would have thought that if someone's involved in inquiry for a number of years, you have an emotional commitment to making sure that the recommendations you made were carried out, and I would have thought that they'd want to put some pressure to ensure that was the case. Mr Sturrock?
Well, you'll be adding to the cost as well. I mean, after all, it's not for people who are hired as contractors, lawyers, to do the inquiry. It's not necessarily for them to secure implementation. You know, I know very little about public administration, but I know quite a lot about building, and I know quite a lot about the law around construction. So what I know about, and I can help with the report. I don't know very much about the machinery of government to put all that into action.
Okay, although you have said that the Scottish Parliament should perhaps have half a day a year to meet and to discuss inquiries and how whether they are.
Well, that was just an idea that came to me. That, if the Scottish Parliament wishes to be informed about the progress of public inquiries in its jurisdiction, there might be merit in a short debate on the floor of in the chamber as to how inquiries are progressing, particularly those that appear to be very expensive and running for a long time.
Mr Sturrock, you've suggested, for example, that a parliamentary committee could be established, or indeed, I suppose, it could be the work of an existing committee to look at delivery.
So in my notes, Convener, for today, I've got our recommendations implemented. Who knows?
Jack?
How is it done? What are the criteria? So it seems to me that what's required here in the big picture is a systematic approach, not an ad hoc approach, so that overall there should be some clear understanding about what happens with recommendations made by those who are reporting on public inquiries. And then perhaps that would mean that in each individual case there would be different approaches to the follow-through, but some sort of action plan. And then that speaks into the point you make about scrutiny. It's a bit like post-legislative scrutiny, I suppose. So yes, my suggestion is that there be some body, now whether that's the Public Inquiries Hub, the Know-How Centre, whatever it's called, or a parliamentary committee or some other statutory body, some body which is responsible overall for perhaps for the overall delivery of public inquiries, but certainly for the implementation of recommendations, including explanations for why recommendations are not implemented, because there may be good reasons for recommendations not being implemented many years down the line. And speaking personally, in my own experience with NHS Highland, I did recommend a review after 1 year, and I'm not sure if that was conducted. I was involved for a while, initially at my own initiative, without pay, to try to see if I could help NHS Highland to consider how to implement some of the suggestions and recommendations. I think I now have some regret I didn't play a more active role. But it was difficult because I was commissioned by the Cabinet Secretary for Health to do a particular job, and the job was done. In a sense, I was functus, as they would say in the law, after that. But I think it's a serious issue. These are huge amounts of public money that have been spent with no obvious accountability for the outputs and outcomes. You know, there's a lot happens, but over the piece, what's the point? For many of them, not all of them, and I don't wish to be critical of many of those which serve a very useful purpose, but these are serious questions, it seems to me.
I think if there's a glaring need for change, organisations often try and get ahead of the game a wee bit and try and change things as inquiries actually progress, so that they're not, then seen to be scratching themselves basically while waiting 5 years for a report to come out.
Well, interestingly, even in my case, I submitted an interim report, I think, in early February, and by the time of my final report, albeit only 18 weeks after I'd started, the three most significant players had moved on, shall we say, from the jobs which they held. And that may have been, in part at least, because of what was being done at the time. So yes, and one would hope that a system could be devised whereby, with regular reporting, perhaps on interim basis, as many have recommended from public inquiries, steps could be being taken during the currency of the public inquiry as lessons are being learned. One of the dangers may be that everybody waits until the end, 10 years, 5 years, 3 years down the line, and it's too late. The tram extension's been built, you know. So perhaps that's another consideration, is what could be done during the currency of an inquiry to learn from what has been said and can be implemented along the way.
Okay,
The
thank you.
chairman might say, well, I don't want to reach my conclusions until I've listened to everything. And that's very much a lawyer's approach, but I think there's a risk with interim reports because you may change your mind.
And that, of course, if I may say, depends upon a linear approach, which is that everything has to be investigated before final conclusions can be reached. But there are those who argue that you can have parallel processes, that you can have modules, as the child abuse inquiry is having, and you can reach conclusions on particular topics on an interim, or even actually on a final basis as part of a sequencing of events.
Yeah, rather than a big bang effect at the end. Okay, I'm going to open up the session to colleagues around the table. The first will be Michelle, to be followed by Liz.
Good morning, both, for joining us today. Following on, I suspect, in similar themes, I wanted to just explore a little bit more about the culture, perhaps, of the legal fraternity in these inquiries. Now, one, of course, makes the assumption that all lawyers operate from complete integrity and ethics, but so that's one view, that they're providing good works. The other view, potentially, is that this is a racket, of which certain law firms or lawyers have found that this is a very, very good way of making money, particularly if you build up a reputation. You can actually roll on from public inquiry to public inquiry. Now, I know that sounds contentious, but I wanted to explore with you your understanding of the tension between these two positions, because clearly there is at least the possibility for that situation to occur. What's your thinking? And critically, is the legal profession able to look at itself and say, this isn't a great look, if there's even a sense that that might be the case? So, John Sturt, I'll come to you first, and then yourself, John Cameron.
Thanks, Michelle. So may I recognise the tension, because in the work that I do, of course, I am dealing with lawyers all the time who are involved in mediations, which, if they're successful, will result in a much lower income from a particular piece of work, if you like, than it might otherwise be the case. So I don't think one has to go as far as to suggest ill will or bad faith. I think one just has to examine the system. It's inherent in the adversarial system, the litigation system, that it is time-consuming, costly, and requires a certain approach to process. And actually, lawyers doing their job, in some ways, need to follow that, because that's the only way. As John suggests, cross-examination, for example, is required, investigation is required to enable that cross-examination to be effective, if that's the system within which you're operating. And it does seem as though many public inquiries are affected by that approach. They become very forensic, very detailed. Lawyers are employed to do a certain job, and particularly if the suggestion is that part of the inquiry's purpose is to allocate blame or fault, then naturally, inevitably, and perhaps professionally, competently, lawyers will have a job to do to protect their clients, and that may involve defence. And it may well be that that then has a similar effect in prolonging the inquiry, both in terms of cost and time. So I don't think one has to infer, as I say, ill will, but recognise by stepping outside the process what the process necessarily entails and results in.
But you do recognise my point that that could occur, that lawyers, we've got no proper financial governance at all that we would understand, that it's in their interest for some lawyers to prolong an inquiry because there's a direct correlation that it will result in more billable hours for them, putting it simply. And indeed, many law firms reward their lawyers by the number of billable hours they put through on a particular
So the economic system in which lawyers operate is one which requires them to generate revenue, to generate profit, and they'll look for pieces of work which will do that. So if this particular piece of work has that effect, then inevitably there is an economic interest. I think what I'm just concerned about, Michelle, is not necessarily implying ill will or bad faith, but stepping back and saying it's almost an inevitable part of the joy of the lawyers doing their job. We need to therefore challenge the very process itself and bring about change. From reading some of the evidence, it seems to me that good lawyers will understand this, and good lawyers will look for ways to minimise unnecessary costs. That also would be a professionally, ethically responsible thing to do. So, no doubt it's a question of balance throughout. And I think I've said enough on the point.
Do you want to come in on that point, John?
Yes, I'm not sure that I've got a great deal to add, except this, that the perception of which you've spoken, which I do recognise, seems to arise very often from headlines, which are generated, or often generated, by lawyers themselves, speaking in public about the business of the inquiry. A strong chairman should discourage that. In fact, he or she should forbid it, because the inquiry should be inward-looking towards the people who are working for the inquiry. Now, I wouldn't want to suggest that all advocates are paragons of virtue and understand neutrality and understand that their only duty is, to the inquiry, to be dispassionate, to be neutral and so on. But that characteristic is a very strong one. And you'll see it well exemplified, for example, in the Crown Office. When people present cases in the High Court, they do so dispassionately, not, isn't that a terrible case, or introducing emotion into the king. The people are skilled when they can do this. And I think that's something that a chairman would be entitled to look for. Okay. So I'm very sensitive to what you, having been the victim of it myself during the Holyrood inquiry, I'm very sensitive to the suggestion that lawyers are simply involved in the process in order to generate revenue, generate better revenue as time goes on. But, sorry, go on.
Just come in with one point. I think there is a cultural issue here which lawyers would do well to consider. Frequently throughout the year, major law firms will announce in the media the profits which they've made and how these profits have increased by X% over previous years. And numbers which are spoken of are huge. And so it's understandable then that members of the public and MSPs might draw certain conclusions as you seek to do. So part of the remedy, I suspect, for this is in the way in which lawyers handle themselves and talk about the generation of revenue.
And on that note, and it's picking up a point the convener made early, surely, there's two bare minimums, and by way of disclosure, in one of my multiple previous lives, I ran large-scale so-called transformation change programs in corporate life, which, as a program manager, I would go in, obviously, collate the terms of reference, the structure. I'd be sitting at the head of it. I would have multiple project managers reporting to me. We would have a kind of project management office that's doing the kind of gubbins. We would have a change control process. We would have a clear established budget. That was entirely my role, and there's no way a project of even 500,000 wouldn't have a proper clear governance structure to manage costs, and that's obviously quite contrary to what we're talking about here. But I suppose it's just fleshing out this. That's one route, but there may well be other routes as well, and it's understanding to what extent lawyers understand that they're not equipped to do that sort of thing, and indeed nor should they be. In fairness, that's not their role. Their role is expertise in the law and a huge capacity for attention to detail. Is that generally recognised, or is this tension, as I referred to you, John Sturrock, that actually probably suits some law firms, that there's not this kind of tidiness already in place, because ultimately it results in increased billable hours, therefore profits?
Well, project management of a public inquiry is in one way no different from what you've described for your own. Turning to the minutiae of it, you will always ask yourself, how long do I need with this witness? Or can this witness provide the evidence in writing so that I can read it at my leisure and report on it, and I don't need to see the witness? And I remember calling witnesses and having a pretty clear idea how long we would need them for, letting them know in advance what we were going to be talking about, and at the end of the day or the end of the morning or the afternoon saying, thank you, you don't need to come back. There were very few occasions when we had to bring people back because the discussion had overrun. Very few. And in that way, we were able to budget quite effectively, I felt anyway. But, you know, lawyers shouldn't be put in charge of administration. That's a truism. You need a professional inquiry secretary, administrator, and I was blessed with one who, you know, didn't tell me half of what was going on because he was managing the money and left me to get on with the job.
And you mentioned earlier, it was yourself, John Campbell, about interface with government in terms, and in fact, both of you have had terms of reference set for the work you've done. During some of our evidence sessions, in fact, it was last week, we heard from the Scottish Police Federation that despite, you know, making clear their concerns about the opportunity costs that the conveners outlined, that really the dialogue, once it was set in train, was very limited. And again, I really appreciate the tension in this, but if the Cabinet Secretary is like the kind of client who's triggered the inquiry, surely they must have some kind of ongoing interest in the implications of it, even if I quite clearly understand they cannot get involved or even be seen to be for very good reasons. But what would your expectations be of a Cabinet Secretary having been instructed to undertake an inquiry through the course of it? Anything at all, or only afterwards?
Are you asking about expectations of the Cabinet Secretary?
Yeah. Your expectations as a chair of an inquiry, do you expect to see them be told what you've got to do, go away and come back years later, or would you expect interim?
I would expect, I think, a Cabinet Secretary to meet with the Chairman from time to time and find out whether there were any impediments to the process anticipated. I read the police evidence, and I'm not going to comment on it because clearly things have arisen, and that's a live case, so it wouldn't be appropriate. But it's quite clear that quite a lot happened that was unexpected. Now, our modern culture, and this is true in planning as well, is to try and avoid ambushes. You can ask questions, you can ask firm questions, but you shouldn't really be ambushing the inquiry or ambushing the chairman or indeed ambushing any witnesses with things that they're not there to talk about. So we made several mistakes in the Holyrood inquiry, and one of them was not planning for long enough before we kicked off. We were under public pressure to get a witness in a witness box, and that came, I'm sorry to say, from politicians. Understandable, but nevertheless, we started before we were ready to start, and we were scrabbling around looking for files and, you know, trying to think of some questions to ask, rather than taking another month, reading the stuff, and formulating the questions properly.
So in my situation, it was a non-statutory inquiry, so it was more flexible, more fluid. So from the,
This was too.
So yours, yes. So from the get-go, I was in regular and helpful contact with Scottish Government officials who were charged with carrying out the commission to me and supporting me, and that included the crafting of the remit. I took it upon myself, when I thought it was appropriate, to communicate with the Cabinet Secretary on my progress, particularly if issues had arisen, and they did, which required the possibility of an extension of time or an increase in the scope of the inquiry. The Cabinet Secretary did not at any time interfere with or seek to influence what I was doing, but I regarded it as part of my role to ensure that it was she at the time, was kept informed of progress.
And for either of you in those instances, did that include questions about the cost and the ongoing governance?
Yes, so in my case, there was an understanding of cost based on a a day rate which had been agreed for the work. There were certain ancillary costs to do with accommodation for the process which was being carried out. Because the number of potential witnesses who came forward greatly increased over what was predicted at the start, it was necessary to go back and have a further conversation about cost, particularly around the number of days which I would need to allocate in order to see all those people who had stepped forward, and which I thought was part of my function to meet. And that involved, frankly, an adjustment of my day rate downwards, because I took the view that there was a global sum which had been agreed, and that was what the expectation was, and therefore that I would try to work within that envelope so far as I could. But we're constantly reviewing that, and I had very much in mind, Michelle, that there was a kind of upper cap, and I would try to work with that, even though the review became more extensive than had been anticipated.
And how about your own direct experience, John Cameron?
I have none, because my inquiry secretary was in charge of the money, and he let me get on with the job.
Right.
And if I had to send somebody to Barcelona or undertake some other investigation, I mean, a lot of time I was down here on the site talking to people. I just did it. Mm-hmm. And if it was going to cost money, I asked him first, but usually it didn't. I mean, you perhaps remember a side issue with the BBC and the publication of a film. It's a long time ago now, but that took us into obtaining separate legal advice on the question of confidentiality of material which was filmed for a television programme. And we felt that we were so close to it, we couldn't give ourselves dispassionate advice. So we went outside and got advice from someone else. That was an extra cost. It wasn't big, but it was an extra cost. And it's a sort of example.
And my last question around costs. I know you said, John Campbell, in your submission that you didn't see that it was necessary, and the conveners already asked you about it, to publish individuals' costs. And I understand the sensitivity about that. However, if you were going to look to effect change, there might be some initial pain where somebody's costs were put in the public domain, but then that would very swiftly change behaviours. So I'm interested in your thought, because in all of these, if I were coming in and consulting this, I'd be saying, what are the things you could do that will immediately make a difference and start to shift the culture? And that seems to me to be one. So tell me a really good reason, if we're focusing on starting to get a proper focus on costs and not just allowing for massive cost overruns, why we wouldn't actively seek to put the cost of everybody in a public inquiry, in the public domain, in exactly the same way as our salaries go into the public domain. We have to declare everything. So give me a really good reason why we wouldn't.
You're putting me in a position where I have to, in a sense, speak for the whole legal profession.
I'm just asking you to speak for yourself.
Well, we operate in a marketplace. So the setting of rates is a negotiated process. Personally, I would have no problem with it being published. I think people are sensitive about that. I think that the report of the inquiry should show the cost of the inquiry broken down in that way, but not necessarily for individuals, because it's personal data.
But it's public money. This is the difference. It's public money.
But it's public money. And if a law firm is employed, for example, over a period of years to run an inquiry or help to run an inquiry, I think that law firm would have to expect the total cost to be published. There isn't, I mean, in the world we live in now, there isn't a really good reason not to have the cost of a public inquiry in the public domain. But people are very sensitive about it for personal reasons. And that's particularly true in a long-running case where the numbers get very large.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you maketh my point.
Yes, yeah. No, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you,
yeah.
But I'm saying that it's a very sensitive, difficult area, and the current culture is to, I think, to seek to keep matters financial private so far as one is concerned. But if you step into the public domain, as you have as a politician, as Crown Counsel do, we all know what Crown Counsel earn, We all know what civil servants earn. It probably is a case for it not being very different or any way different for public. Okay. I think I'm persuaded.
And this talks to a cultural issue, doesn't it, John Stewart?
I remember being worried that the figure of whatever it was, less than £150,000, would seem enormous and therefore should not be made public. It's funny, all things are relative. I think my concern, Michelle, would be that the premise might be wrong, that you are seeking to achieve behaviour change, cost reduction, through a mechanism which is the publication of costs, earnings, if you like. I'm not sure that that would necessarily be the result, because if the public inquiry is being chaired effectively, and the chair is competent at managing time, and because that may be the fundamental issue, then the cost of the lawyers, to take that example, would be a function of the requirements of the inquiry, and if properly chaired, the requirement of the chair in functioning. So I wonder if one needs to look at this from a slightly different end of the telescope and just be very careful that in pursuing a particular approach, you might not achieve the behaviour change because it might not be the lever that actually achieves that change that you really need to pull.
And what would be then?
Well, I go back to the education, the training, the competence of the chair or chairs, or whoever it is that manages the process. And there's a whole issue then about whether or not it should be, for example, a retired judge, whether or not you have other people involved. John has referred to the important role of the secretary to the inquiry. There's a whole question mark around the skills and competencies that are required to run an effective public inquiry in the modern era with all that entails.
Okay. And that leads back to government.
If I may just say one more thing. I think in the public mind, cost is very often equiparated with value. If a junior counsel on a daily rate does nothing all day except take notes, that isn't necessarily seen as being valuable. Mm-hmm. But actually, it might be very valuable because that person is then going to contribute to the next day's questions in a private discussion. And so there is a value which you don't see. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you have the person asking the questions and he makes a mess of it, she makes a mess of it, then that's seen as bad value. Mm-hmm. Oh, get rid of him. And we've seen that too. We've seen that in the televised inquiries where, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. And you know what lawyers are like. I mean, they're much bitchier than anybody else, and they will criticise.
I would dispute that with politicians. But
well, they will criticise each other's performance in a way which is wholly unjustified, because you never quite know until you get to your feet what form or inflection the question is going to take. Sometimes no question at all.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
To be followed by John.
Thank you. The record that I'm representing some former patients of LGML in the public inquiry. Yeah. May I ask if either of you would give a view as to why you think there is an increasing demand for public inquiries?
Speaking from experience, the First Minister was... no, let me start again. There is a view that a public inquiry may be a device to get a difficult problem off a politician's desk. There was something of that in the Holyrood inquiry. The late Margaret MacDonald, of blessed memory, rather bullied Jack McConnell into starting the inquiry before the building was finished.
Yep.
And what none of us understood was that the occurrence, the commissioning of a public inquiry would actually set the professional teams on edge with each other when the thing that was really needed was for people to be working together. And we saw that, the surveyors, the architects, and so on. A clamour for public inquiry, I think, is, I don't know, press-driven, probably.
Mr. Sturrock, do you have a view?
Yeah, I've just sketched out 2 or 3 thoughts. I think we have moved into an even greater culture of blame seeking fault finding, finding somebody upon whom the responsibility in a negative sense can be foisted for things that go wrong. And now almost for anything that goes wrong, there needs to be somebody like that to be found. So that may be one aspect of it. The second aspect may be the increasing loss of trust in public institutions, which evidence suggests is manifest. The third may be a lack of understanding about the purpose and nature of public inquiries, not least perhaps amongst those commissioning them. Fourthly, it may be an easy reflexive way of dealing with a difficult problem. The phrase that Emma Ayrton used, which I picked up, was uncritical repetition. Now, she was using that in the context of how an inquiry itself was actually conducted, but it may also be a feature in the response of those commissioning it to difficult issues. So a combination of all these and no doubt many more.
You've both mentioned the Highland inquiry, NHS Highland. Do you feel at the end of the day, and it was obviously done slightly differently from other public inquiries, do you feel at the end of the day that those people who had been clamouring for that public inquiry felt more satisfied with the public inquiry in relation to some of the other public inquiries where people have obviously been dissatisfied with what resulted?
I'm probably...
I wasn't involved with the Highland, with the bullying inquiry at all.
So there are two aspects to that, I think, if I may. One is that we conducted our survey towards the end of the process to find out how people felt about it. And there was an overwhelming majority who felt that it had been a useful exercise, that they had felt listened to, that the issues they wanted to raise had been raised, and so forth and so on. The information about that is all in the report which I prepared. Subsequently, steps were taken by and in NHS Highland to do at least three things. One was to instigate a process called the healing process, which allowed those who had suffered to take part in an engagement in which their concerns, often traumas, were addressed, and also, correspondingly, in which compensation could be paid where that was appropriate. So that was one thing. Secondly, the whole approach to management in NHS Highland, which had been one of the critical issues and one of the causes of the problems, changed. That took two chief executives to get there, but it did change quite significantly. And thirdly, there was a recognition that board governance, which had been ineffective, needed to change, and steps were taken with the appointment of a new chair, with new approaches to training, and actually a Scotland-wide approach, I think, would be reflected in that. So changes did occur. Whether or not that addressed all of the issues all the people had, I very much doubt. And you'll still hear people in Highland with whom I have some contact ongoing who will say there's still a bullying culture, there's still harassment.
But it's an important question to ask because, as you've rightly set out, there are other ways of doing inquiries. And we've had other witnesses at the committee who have suggested the same. And if this committee ends up recommending that there should be a change in the focus to some inquiries, we have to be able to ensure that there is sufficient evidence to prove that the type of inquiry that NHS Highland was subject to can work as well as a judge-led inquiry that goes on for a very long period of time and things. And I think it's just trying to get at the... I mean, I can't remember whether it was Mr Campbell, Mr Sturrock, who rightly said at the beginning that public inquiries are really not entirely all about what those people who are demanding it want. It's about specifically drilling down on what happened, why it happened, but the second part, which is more difficult, and as you rightly pointed out, Mr Sturrock, different skill set, about what should be done to try to address things in the future. None of that's all about the blame, which I think a lot of people are looking for. And therefore, if we're going to address the concerns of the public and also the concerns of government about the costs and the efficiency of public inquiries, I think we have to look at the different ways that they might work. And so I'm just interested in your views as to whether you think that for some very difficult cases, it's better to have a judge-led inquiry, for which I think the public often has a great deal of respect, because it's a, it's a judge, an independent judge who is well trusted by the public, or whether that can be done in another way that's slightly less adversarial. I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
I don't think that the commissioning of a judge-led inquiry necessarily means that it will be an adversarial process, with respect. It might be. And I take your point about the trust that a judge may almost automatically engender in the public. But there are others than judges. It's not unheard of to ask senior counsel to do inquiries. It's not unheard of to ask doctors. And we've seen, sorry, I forgot the lady's name, Frances Jay, who's not a lawyer at all, conduct a successful inquiry in England. So, where your question takes us, I think, is not necessarily the appointment of a judge or a person of eminence, but it takes us into a questioning process about the form that the inquiry should take. Now, if it's about something relatively simple like a cost overrun of a Parliament building, which went from 50 to 471 million, then you need to know how that took place. If it's something which is much closer to people's emotional hearts, then I think it's a different form of inquiry. And the point that John is making is that litigation style is not necessarily the best method of getting to an understanding of what happened.
I'm just picking up the points that you've both made, that in the current environment, there is, sadly, in my opinion, an increasing mistrust in some public bodies who are not as efficient as they should be, and therefore they're not dealing with some cases in a way that is effective. And that's my main reason, I think, why the demand for public inquiries is increasing, because the government and its agencies are not actually able to get answers to the question, very genuine questions that should have been. But the interesting point about this is that that has a trust element to it. That the public is looking for trust. And sometimes I think people feel that there is a trust within a judge-led inquiry because that's what they feel is the right thing to do. But actually what you are suggesting, again rightly, is that there are other ways of doing inquiries. And it's
but
just
you need a figurehead. Sorry to interrupt, but you need a figurehead. I'm
the public trust.
You need a champion to sort of enshrine that public trust in a way.
And it's trying to marry together these two issues, which are very difficult, with a cost, an opportunity cost, and also government efficiency. They don't quite fit together, and I think that's one of the really big challenges for this committee as to how we go forward.
So we've got a number of things going on here, a number of issues at play. So a question for you, not for me, is whether or not a non-practising QC, as I then was, leading the NHS Highland review, was more or less effective in terms of credibility, reliability and trust than perhaps a judge would have been. So that's the first question. And John has made the point, it doesn't need to be a judge. The question mark really is around what are the attributes of a particular individual that would result in public confidence. And the second, and again John has made this point already also, is that just because a process is judge-led doesn't mean to say that it needs to be overly litigious, adversarial and forensic. A judge could have done what I did if the judge had those skills, competencies and permissions to do it in that way. So I think all of these issues are. There's a trade-off in all of this. I mean, Laura Dunlop and John again today have mentioned time, cost, and if you like, quality or justice or output. These are always going to be in tension. They're going to be in balance, and you have to work out overall what's a proportionate response to the situation. And I wrote down the words last night. What will be sufficiently effective? And so please don't look for perfection in any or all of these. The question is, in particular circumstances, who, what, how, why, when, where will work most effectively for this situation.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Could I just come back one quickly? You might find a ready analogue in the planning theatre. The chief, when a case comes in on appeal, it's sent to a reporter. The reporter has discretion under the rules as to how he or she will conduct that inquiry. Will I do it in writing? Can I be satisfied just to go there and have a look myself and not receive any evidence? Do I need a hearing on some topics but not others? Or do I need a full-blown inquiry with cross-examination and people being beaten up in the witness box because of something that is highly controversial? A combination of those is the reporter's discretion. So the reporter decides what method he or she's going to involve. The report comes out, either quicker or slower, depending on what you pick. But the point I want to leave you with, I think, is that it's the chairman's discretion as to how the topics, and that's about good planning, divide it into topics, and then decide how you want to deal with each topic.
Thank you.
By Craig.
Thanks so much, Convener. Well, can I thank you both for your answers so far? I've particularly enjoyed some of them. I like the one about the 250 pages for the report. That's the first time any of our witnesses have said, they set a target for the report. And that's been one of my kind of questions is, how definitely can we set targets at the beginning? So, I did say to one of our previous witnesses, if we said to you that you've got 2 years and £5 million, just do the best job you can within that. And his answer was, I just wouldn't do it. So he didn't like the target being that tight. Am I unfair suggesting that that could happen, Mr. Sturrock?
That's exactly the situation in which I found myself. So I was given 3 months by the Cabinet Secretary for Health to carry out my particular process. I regarded that, therefore, as my target and my responsibility to fulfill if I could. There was some extension of that, some relatively minor extension of that, because, as I said earlier on, the much larger number of people involved. But one of the byproducts of that was that there were certain people I couldn't see. And that by agreement, there came a point where we said, well, there's a cut-off now in terms of those who've contacted me. What we'll do is that we'll make sure that there's an ongoing process so that others who have not had an opportunity to meet with me can in the future have their concerns addressed. So there's a very clear time-bound approach to it. And it seemed to me that for the purposes of that initiative, where what people wanted was some sort of outcome reasonably quickly, it was perfectly appropriate to do that. So I was perfectly comfortable with that. So I would take a different view. I think it was Lord Hardy who took the view.
Yes.
I think it may be perfectly good reasons for him taking that view, given the nature and circumstances of his inquiry.
Mr. Campbell, one of the arguments that's been put is that if we did set such a very tight timescale and cost, that would undermine the independence of the chair. Do you think it would?
I suppose a sensitive chair might say so, but you'd have to leave the door ajar in case something came up which the chair wanted to investigate. But as a principle, I don't really see anything too difficult about what you're proposing. Often you go to court and a judge will say, you've got half an hour. I spoke earlier on about timing witnesses, and certainly watching Lord Hutton, it would have been a brave man or woman who would have gone over the half hour. So that's perhaps not quite answering your question. In budgeting for an inquiry, you can't begin to do it unless you sit down with a programme and you work hard at your programme before you put numbers on it. And then you'll come to a final figure. And if you say to an inquiry chair, well, you've got £1 million and you've got 9 months, or whatever the figure is, if you employed my monthly checking or weekly checking of rolling costs, you'd be able to control that. But it does requires a discipline of an auditor, and I wouldn't pretend to be one. And I think most people would say, don't employ lawyers to do administration. Employ people who are good at administration.
Well, we'll create some more jobs for accountants, and perhaps that's a fair answer. I mean, I think one of the phrases you used earlier on was an inquiry can grow arms and legs, and I take the point that something new can come up that nobody knew about, so that is out with our control. But if an inquiry does grow arms and legs, is that the chair's responsibility? Is it the minister's responsibility? Is it because the terms of reference weren't tight enough?
It may not be that the terms of reference were not tight enough. It may be that it's wholly unexpected. But sorry, I don't want to stammer through this. If something comes up which is unexpected,
yes,
then it's for the chairman to decide whether he or she wants to look into it. And necessarily, if you want to look into it, it's going to take time. And necessarily, therefore, it's going to cost a little more money than you had, or perhaps a lot more money than you had budgeted.
And how does the chair make that decision? Because did you say just now that if the chair would like to look into it, or is it
relevance, whether it has relevance in terms of the remit?
Yes.
And drawing the remit tightly or not tightly, as the case may be, is what would determine that. The risk, though, is that you risk public disfavour if you say, well, I'm not looking at that because it's not for us today, and then the public will howl at you and say, oh, but you should have looked at it. So yes, that's an unanswerable question, I'm afraid.
Okay. Mr. Sir?
Just a quick observation. Yes, you've got to be very careful about the use of language. I mean, the expression grows arms and legs is a pejorative expression if you think about it. And it's easy to use that and then imply that what has happened ought not to have happened. Mm-hmm. But the discovery of new, perhaps unknown issues which fall squarely and relevantly within the terms of reference of the inquiry will inevitably and necessarily involve more time and money being expended. It's how that's controlled and how that's managed, I think, which is the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And while you're speaking, I mean, going back to the Highland one, which others have asked you about, I thought it was very interesting, and some of the phrases that I think you used. It was a safe space, things were discussed confidentially, it was not forensic, and there was no legal advice or representation. I mean, you were asked about people's satisfaction with this, and you sounded positive. Did you have any kind of comeback on these points, that people would have wanted it in public, would have wanted a lawyer?
There were, not during the currency of the process itself. The issue of maximalisation arose, and you've discussed this, I know, in the committee. And so my report in its draft form was sent to a number of people who were explicitly or implicitly criticised. And at that stage, there were concerns raised about process, fairness, and so forth and so on, which I was required to address, and I did address. To that extent, there were some concerns expressed, but apart from that, and I hope that these were addressed appropriately, there was not, as far as I'm aware, nothing else significantly raised about that particular approach.
So people accepted that. Again, I mean, Liz Smith was asking you quite a lot about how things have changed over the years, and again, that phrase, the present culture would lead to less openness and more defensiveness, did kind of concern me a bit, if that's the culture we're in nowadays. So what people are... And is that the case? If we have a statutory public inquiry, do you think people will be less open and more defensive, whereas in your hospital type inquiry, people were more open and less defensive?
So the way in which I conducted this, and perhaps because I am accustomed now to facilitating dialogue rather than exchanging in forensic examination of evidence and examination and cross-examination, was very much to give people the opportunity, I suppose, to tell their story. Uh-huh. And in a very open way to do that, in a way that they hadn't done with sometimes anybody ever before. And that was only done by providing the safety of a confidential space in which that could be done.
So that wouldn't have happened if it had been in the public?
Well, it would have been interesting to see what would have happened. I mean, you take the example of Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Right, okay, I was thinking.
And we should consider some of these other processes, whether they become the main way in which some matters are dealt with, or ancillary parts of a process, because you can have parallel process, different things happening at different times. So I would have thought, but I don't know, that it might not have been quite so easy for some of those with whom I spoke to have been as candid as they were with me if the matter had been conducted in public. Now, there are pros and cons of that, John, because obviously there are issues about due process and fairness and so forth. But my approach was to give people the opportunity to say what they had to say, and then to, as far as I could, articulate what had been said in my report, having always checked with them that I could use the particular quotation. I used extensive quotations so that people felt they had been heard and that their issues were expressed.
Did you tend to use quotations without saying who had said it?
Absolutely. Yes. That was just my general approach. I don't. Oh, there may have been circumstances in which I referred to individuals in particular, but my general approach was to capture sentiments rather than particular points made by particular people. Yes. But I did that extensively, and that, I think, turned out to be very powerful, because people felt, over 300 ultimately who expressed a view, people felt that they had been heard.
Yes. But the downside, presumably, is somebody reading the report, a victim or somebody like that, would not be able to pin down, oh, I can blame that person. If that's the downside. I mean, I made very clear from the outset that I was not engaged in a blame game, and I would not be. As it happened, you could, in my report, infer, and sometimes explicitly so, that there were criticisms made of certain people, such as the chief executive, for example, such as the chair of the board, so that where appropriate and where it seemed to be helpful in a forward-looking way, I would make reference to groups or specific individuals. But as I say, that wasn't the primary purpose. The primary purpose was to give the opportunity for people to be heard, to diagnose what had actually been going on, and then to make what were a number of recommendations about how things might be done differently going forward. Mr Campbell, I mean, that kind of range of options that we're hearing about, is that the way we should be going forward?
I'm hearing this with great interest, but focusing back to Holyrood, we were looking at cost and money. And the cost escalated because a lot of people either made poor estimates to begin with or didn't follow the rules and incurred cost without it ever being anticipated in advance. I mean, something as simple as moving a door handle or moving a tap in a bathroom, can cost 30 quid.
Yes.
But you multiply that by the number of bathrooms in the building. I won't go into war stories today, but there are lots of anecdotes like that where additional costs were necessitated by contractors' requirements, which had not been anticipated.
Yes.
So, a facilitative...
Oh, you need a new door for the House of Lords.
a facilitative atmosphere for that sort of inquisition was not really very helpful. I think if I was doing it again, though, I would do it in a room like this and not in a litigious courtroom, which is what we had. We borrowed the courtroom from the Land Court in Grosvenor Crescent, and it was very much set up as a court with the little camera winking in the corner because the whole thing was streamed on the internet. So people were on their best formal behaviour, I hope, anyway.
And do you think that made them less open and less candid?
Yes, undoubtedly. Yes, undoubtedly.
Yes. Okay. Right,
you saw people going into the box and checking where the camera was.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much.
Morning.
A number of the points that I was going to raise have been already covered. So, I suppose, Mr Sturrock, just in terms of the implementation of recommendations, obviously the public's expectation is that the inquiry will be wide-reaching, fair and reach conclusions, but there seems to be this implementation gap. Why do you think there is such slow and scant implementation of some of the more fundamental recommendations that come forward out of public inquiries?
Well, I suspect that one issue will be the passage of time, that by the time that the report comes out, it's yesterday's news, effectively, and there is not the same imperative or momentum behind effecting change. Secondly, maybe the length of any particular report itself, which may, in a busy world, put off people from actually digesting it and thinking through the implications. Thirdly, and this is entirely understandable, it may well be that the recommendations made are not acceptable to those who would implement the decisions. They're too expensive, they're not appropriate, they've been addressed already, and so forth. So there could be a multitude of reasons. But I think maybe the point here is we don't know. We don't know. I don't know. I don't know if you know what the process is by which, for example, the Tram Inquiry report was considered. No doubt it was accepted and comments were made about it. But what has happened and what is going to happen and what are the reasons for what is happening occurring?
In your submission, you suggest three potential ways of toughening up the accountability around the implementation. One being a parliamentary committee being established, or a statutory body, or you suggest a ministerial accountability panel, as we're seeing in terms of fatal accident inquiry recommendations. All of these appear to have some merit. Have you given any thought as to which you think might be the most effective way of approaching a public inquiry?
To be honest, no. But if I could just respond briefly, the idea of some sort of statutory body which has some sort of role in the oversight of public inquiries is an attractive one, I think. A number of your witnesses have spoken about that. So this could be part of the functions of that. Otherwise, I would have thought parliamentary scrutiny is the optimal way to proceed with this, and be very clear about having a committee or which committee is charged with this function, in the same way as you, I would imagine, ought to scrutinise legislation as to whether or not it's been applied down the line, how effective it has been.
Mr Campbell, you suggested, I think it was referred to earlier, that perhaps it would be an annual parliamentary debate or something around that. I think one of the frustrations of many MSPs is we have annual debates on a number of things, particularly targets that are missed, and then we have the same debate the following year, and it doesn't actually get to the root cause of the problem that we're trying to solve. Would there be any merit, therefore, in looking back at the original legislation around public inquiries to provide some compulsion or mandatory implementation mechanism that would actually make it incumbent upon government not just to set up public inquiries, but to formally respond in a timely manner with actions to solve the problems and to prevent those mistakes happening in future?
Well, I think there's a dilemma between a government responding to the product of the report of a public inquiry and implementing recommendations. Because one clearly is often a political response, the other is usually an administrative response. But procurement of public buildings may provide a good example. When the report was published, there was a discussion in Parliament, but it was largely a courtesy debate, and the chairman was thanked and all that. But the practical result of the inquiry was the promulgation of new procurement rules. We were in the EU at that time, so everything was fashioned around the EU procurement rules. But nevertheless, Scotland got its own new set of rules. Now, I would like to say that no public project has gone over budget since then, but of course that's not the case. I'm attracted by the idea of an inquiries unit within the government's establishment as a repository for expertise. One of the earlier witnesses, I think, spoke about this. It may have been Lord Hardy, I don't know. Where expertise can be gathered and kept and then used the next time. Because there are different kinds of inquiry, as we've sort of teased out today. Those with a high emotional content, those involving death or tragedy, personal issues, and those involving money, which is cold and neutral. So there's an attraction, I think, to looking at an accumulation of expertise in one place. Whether that's part of the Parliament's establishment or whether it's part of the government's establishment, I can't say. But there's no point in reinventing the wheel every time. And that's what we seem to be doing. When the now Lord President, then Mr. Paul Cullen, was commissioned to look at subsidence in Gilmerton, which was an issue. It was a short, sharp inquiry, but he started by devising his own rules for the inquiry. Now, if he'd had the benefit of the assistance of a skilled unit, he might have saved some time. I think we would have saved some time as well at the Holyrood inquiry. We literally started with an empty room and no papers. Who do we ask for papers? You know, how does the IT work? Should we be here at all, or should we be in a different room from the chairman? And we were not. We were all in one place, and you know, that sometimes didn't feel all that comfortable. You want to talk about the chairman, and he's in the room. You can't do that. So there are all these. They sound rather petty, these questions, when I'm spelling them out like this, but those are the mechanics of day to day. Because it's a tough gig running an inquiry, as Laura Dunlop said. I think you know, it's hard work, and you don't get many weekends off.
Just finally, Mr. Sturrock, there is a sense that ministers are very keen to get the issue off the desk, as was referred to earlier, so therefore hence why they will pass it to public inquiry. There's a view that the report then sits on the minister's desk 8 years later gathering dust and nothing may happen to it. Therefore, if there was some method through which government were forced to adopt the recommendations for an inquiry, presumably it may have two effects. Maybe more effective in the sense that actually you would see actions flowing from them, but also ministers may be less keen to establish them if they thought that then they were going to be held accountable for those recommendations. So is that something we should be looking at?
I see that, but what if the minister doesn't like the recommendations and they're contrary to party policy? Or, I beg your pardon, sorry.
As well.
It may be a different government with a different political drive, and therefore, you know, you can't force them to inquire.
They might actually want buildings that go millions over budget, in other words.
No, that's not what I mean at all.
But the point may again be the point at which we started, and that is transparency. What at least you're entitled to is a very clear explanation about what has or has not happened in consequence of the recommendations being made. So why?
Great, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Michael.
Both for very compelling and full evidence. I've just got a couple of small areas to pick up on. Mr. Sturrock, I suppose the time cost effectiveness balance. Can I draw you a little bit more on the cost, which various members have touched on, and obviously is part of the basis of inquiry. I mean, that bill's now running, I think, over £230 million. I mean, would you both recognise that the costs, as people who have participated, are out of control?
Yes.
Yes.
You could build a ferry for that.
Fair point, but certainly not two.
Forgive me,
please.
A simple yes doesn't quite do it. Yes, but why? Now, Michelle might say, well, there are too many lawyers involved, and they're all milking the process for whatever they can. The chairman might say, well, actually, I need these lawyers because they're all helping me. Some are in England, some are in Scotland. I think in Scotland we're a bit more expeditious. I think English public inquiries seem to take a very long time and involve a very large number of people. But I don't know how big a team Lady Hallett has. I know my team was far too small. And, we were literally exhausted by the end of it. In fact, we gave up working 5 days a week because we were all on our knees with tiredness. And Peter said, 4 days a week. Lord Hutton said, nobody works on this inquiry after 5 p.m. You're all going home. But mind you, they started early in the morning. But he was very clear about that. And when it came to writing the inquiry report, he locked himself away with the proceedings and wrote it himself. May I just finish? We didn't do that. Sorry, I'm wandering slightly from your question. But the writing of the report was pretty much a collective effort.
May I make what I think is maybe a fairly fundamental point? I made the remark about ferries in a jocular way. However, I think that what we see in the conduct of public inquiries and the possibility that costs are out of control, another example of a more fundamental problem in Scotland, which is that our approach to decision-making, complex issues, negotiation, and addressing tough issues is suboptimal. And that suboptimal approach is leading to far greater cost than is necessary and to poorer outcomes. So there's a paradox here. Public inquiries are often about these situations, but they themselves reflect the same underlying suboptimal approach that I would identify as being problematic in Scottish decision-making.
That's very valuable. Can I take you into the area of time? Then Lord Hardy in his evidence this, I think it's fair to say, offered some level of regret. He said it was 9 years for the Trams inquiry, and he said he would much rather have spent that time with his grandchildren. Is it a sustainable system when you have people, as you're describing, Mr. Campbell, saying people on their knees have worked on it for years? You have essentially at the top of this a single figure, which you both, I think, are advocating for, who is responsible and an advocate for the inquiry, but it is giving a huge part of their life over to part of this. It feels to me like there's almost a single point of failure there. We have got other members have touched on the pool of people that we are choosing chairs of inquiries from. I mean, it must for some people feel like something they just don't want to be involved in.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
It is fair. And part of the planning process is trying to decide on the size of your team. Again, from my own experience, ours was too small.
Yes.
And, that put the pressure on me because I was on my feet every day. I'm not weeping about it because, a lot of it was very good fun and very interesting. But I could have done with a junior because you do get very sick of the sound of your own voice. What's the serious point? The serious point is it's part of the planning. And we had a team of 4. We should probably have had a team of 6. Luckily, everybody was diligent and was chosen because not because they knew what they were doing, because none of us did at the beginning, but they learned very quickly. And managing information. Managing information 20 years ago it involved computers, but it didn't involve artificial intelligence. All our documents were on CDs, and we had about a lot of them. Can't remember how many documents, but nothing compared with the information that Lord Hardy had to consider.
May I commend to you the document I've made reference to earlier by the Centre for Effective Dispute Resolution, CEDAR, which covers a number of these points, and I'll send it to the clerk. This raises questions about the design of the process, the methodology which is adopted, the purpose of an inquiry, and in particular it raises questions, given your comment about single points of failure, about by whom and how these projects are conducted, and whether or not it would be appropriate to have more than one individual. It's appropriate to have more than one individual involved in the overall conduct of such an inquiry. And if you begin to have parallel processes where different things are happening simultaneously for perhaps good reasons, or as CEDAR suggests, you have a process of fact-finding and then quite separately a process of creative solution-seeking, you could begin to disperse that and reduce that risk of failure. These are all questions which are pretty fundamental, but require you to step outside the convention, the approach to public inquiries, and look at the whole thing anew and quite differently. So it's not just tinkering with the way in which it works now, but actually stepping back and saying, are there different ways in which these purposes can be achieved? And if so, how? By whom? And with what support?
So, closing on this area, you're both men of great experience in this area, hence why you're sitting in front of us. If somebody came to you today and asked you to take on a public inquiry and to lead one, I'm not making a comment on age, but would you decide that that was a good way to, or a possibility for you?
Yeah, I wouldn't put it higher than a possibility, but yes, only because of age. But yes, of course. It's if a government minister asks you to do something for your country, then there's a strong compulsion to do it, still strong obligation to do it. And I know that's what Peter felt. Peter, who's dead now, was asked by Jack McConnell from an opposite party to chair the inquiry. And he'd been Lord Advocate and he'd been a member of the House of Lords and had a distinguished career. And I said to him one day, well, why are you doing this? You could be living in the country and shooting pheasants or whatever you do. And he said, because Jack asked me to do it. And happy to take on the responsibility. So
So my answer would be yes. However, I could not contemplate doing what Lord Hardy did or what Lady Smith is doing at the moment. And I would wish, as I had the privilege of doing, to be part of a discussion about how the particular inquiry which I might be asked to be involved in was conducted.
Okay. My last question then is about, I think, your own submission, Mr Campbell. You said rapidity in delivering findings is important. Interim reports are often useful in a long and complicated matter. Are interim reports underused?
Sorry, I didn't catch
interim reports. Are they underused? Or do we?
Are they underused?
Yeah. Do we not see enough of them given the length of inquiries?
I don't know about underused. It depends on the case, but I suspect yes. I think Lady Smith's been very conscious that she has been sitting there. I don't quite know how she's managed to do it, but she's done it. And her reports, if you follow that case, follow the inquiry, have been very valuable reading. I don't know that Lord Hardy did issue interim reports. Maybe he did. We certainly didn't. Lady Hallett has issued interim reports already from the English COVID inquiry. People want to, there is evidently a public interest, and therefore, I think the answer to your question is a guarded yes.
Whether they're underused or not, I really can't offer a view, but there is clearly benefit in having regular reporting, perhaps not even under the title interim, but periodic, on particular issues, the development of the process, timescales and so forth. It will all depend on circumstance.
Okay, thank you.
If you could manage parliamentary time, picking up Mr Hoy's question earlier on, inquiries which are in train, when that debate comes round, could be asked to report to Parliament on progress. That wouldn't be difficult for a chairman to do. Oh, I'm 2 weeks away from finishing, or I'm whatever.
You've obviously not seen the parliamentary timetable for the next 2 weeks. Thank you, Chair.
Exactly. We don't have like years to rumble on. We get 4 minute or 6 minute speeches. Just one further question from me, and that's we've seen a plethora of public inquiries, so the numbers are increasing. So it's not just the time and cost, but the overall numbers. Should the bar be raised by which a public inquiry is established? I mean, it may be that the press and individual organisations may be clamouring for them, but should there be set criteria in terms of, before a public inquiry can be triggered, rather than just the decision of a minister based on the kind of, the Fourth Estate and others calling for it?
Mm-hmm.
There should certainly be a rationale for public inquiry. There should be an understanding of the purpose of a public inquiry and why it's necessary in a particular situation, and perhaps there could be a more articulate set of criteria that could be applied. Whether it exists now or not, Convener, I don't know. But as with all these things, what we're craving here is explanation, clarity, understanding of why certain things are being done or not done. And there seems to be a bit of a vacuum in a number of respects in the context of public inquiries in this country.
I think it would be possible to draft a set of criteria, but they would necessarily be somewhat nebulous.
Yeah.
All motherhood and apple pie. But you're asking a question, should the bar be raised? Should it be more difficult to have public inquiries? Of course, maybe behind your question is that's a way of saving money.
Well, I mean, there's a lot more now than there was 20 or 30 years ago, and
Yes,
there doesn't
indeed.
seem to be any real reason that I can discern as to why that would be the case. I mean, ministers perhaps are more likely to trigger than they were before, and there's also, I think sometimes you wonder why was there an inquiry into X when you could just have easily inquired into Y. It seems to be, rather obscure as to what the specific reasoning behind one inquiry over another happens to be. Michelle? Oh, sorry, I thought you were coming. Oh, Michael, sorry. It's Michael.
Sorry, this is for the record. I was remiss in not putting on the record my own involvement in the Eldramel inquiry on behalf of constituents.
That's fine.
To do so. Thank you.
Sorry, so is this really that the only thing I was wanting to conclude on?
You might not achieve a reduction in public inquiries. if you set clear criteria and a clear understanding of the basis upon which they are initiated, that may or may not have an impact on the number of them. But you have much greater clarity and certainty.
Well, I think you would have to have minimum criteria. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to have one, but it would mean that you, before an inquiry was launched, you would have to meet a number of set criteria, I would have thought.
Do you not think, sorry to answer your question with a question, but do you not think ministers, as senior politicians, would rather guard their right, their discretionary right to either have an inquiry or not?
Oh, I'm absolutely sure they
Depending
would.
on the amount of noise.
I'm sure they would, but I mean, you know, as has been mentioned before, it can be, in some circumstances, to get them out of a tight spot politically rather than necessarily for the long-term public good, and that's why I'm thinking that even if ministers get to say, well, this is something that we would certainly want to consider, but, you know, in a more diplomatic way, you haven't quite met the criteria for having one, because we could really have inquiries into, you know, myriad different things, and where would we be then? So it's about having a kind of sensible, optimal position which also defends the value of having an inquiry rather than just being something that's grasped at when people are concerned that the services that they thought would deliver for them haven't. Anyway, are there any further points either of you would like to make before they wind up this session?
I don't believe so, for myself.
No, thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion, and it's a very important discussion, and thank you for the courteous and thoughtful way in which you're conducting it. It's a matter of real importance. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say how delighted I am that you've both been able to come and give evidence today. It has been really, really invaluable in terms of our overall inquiry. And we will continue that after summer recess. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you all. Thank you.
That was the last item on our public agenda. We will go into private session. So I'll just call a 5-minute break to allow our witnesses and broadcasting and the official report to leave.
Thank you very much.